Hi everyone, I'm Silvan and you're listening to the Silvates podcast. The podcast this week I have Mary Bolingbroke on, and Mary is an osteopath who has had over 30 years in the industry. We're going to be talking about the death and dying process. This is a trigger warning for anyone who does feel a bit sensitive around this topic. This might not be the session that you might need to hear today, maybe another time, but feel free to listen in because Mary has a wealth of experience on the topic. And I'm so excited to see her again. Hi, Mary.
Hi, Sylvan. Thank you so much for inviting me onto your platform. It's lovely to see you and to meet you and to connect with all your viewers and listeners. And thank you.
No, thank you for coming on. I think we met last year when you did a talk at the ESO, the European School of Osteopathy, on death and dying. And I was so excited. I know it sounds like a juxtaposition, but I was so excited to listen to you talk because prior to that, I hadn't really heard a lot of osteopaths talking about this. And, a lot of the places I was listening to were coming from the States and from other professions. But you were the first osteopath I heard talking about this subject matter. And it really resonated with me. So thank you for doing your talk and for sort of keeping in touch over the last year.
It's my absolute pleasure. Yeah. And of course, whilst the subject of death and dying in a way never changes, it's eternal, we are in a very different world currently, having gone through COVID and everything that's happening with the climate. So we're not just looking at the death and dying of a family member, for example, or ourselves, but we're seeing the motif of death in many, many different ways, particularly at the moment, it seems. So I think this subject becomes more and more apposite, more important.
Absolutely. And I think so many people, I almost think of sort of myself at least, before experiencing death of a loved one or someone close to me, and then me having experienced that and being almost very different to approaching sort of how I think about this and how I talk about this afterwards. And it's almost I feel like such a different person in a way. I don't know how you approach this and how you sort of expand on what the death and dying sort of transition is.
I think one of the first things that as we start to consider this, is our almost instantaneous reaction, even to the words death and dying. We, by and large, find that exceptionally uncomfortable. We react with collection of emotions, largely fear and denial. Why is it so difficult for us as a society, and becoming more so, to sit, even with the idea of death and dying, aside from the possible sitting with a friend, a colleague, a relative, a child, an animal who is in the process of that transition? And I think what happens is that from very early on, as an individual and as a society, we see and understand that death is inevitable, it's non-negotiable, it's final, or it appears to be, and it most certainly cannot be undone. Now, our ego finds that incredibly difficult because our ego is afraid of anything that it can't negotiate with. So our egos become very, very afraid of death. And what do? They set up a strategy. Our ego sets up a strategy of denial. So whilst we can see death happening around us all the time, we pretend it's not going to happen. It's never going to happen. And it's especially never going to happen to us. So that's the first step, that we've denied that there's even this prospect. And then what we do is we project that outwards. So then we become more comfortable with being able to say, okay, I can understand that there is death, but it's not going to happen to me. So everybody else will sadly eventually die. And it looks like at the moment, huge number of creatures and ice caps and rainforests, they seem to be dying. It looks like various organizations and the very structures of our civilization seem to be in their death throes. It looks like the NHS is on its knees. It looks like the education system, the financial banking system. But having said all that, I will probably survive. Now, you can see what's going to happen. What we then do, we've set up denial and projection. The next thing we do is to protect ourselves from the very slightest possibility that it might be us, is we say, what can I do to protect myself from that? So your ego says, well, it's clearly a really massive change that would happen. So I will make sure that I protect myself from any kind of change or loss. Well, change or loss is basically transition, isn't it? But your ego starts to say, well, transitions are dangerous, so let's try and limit them. So then you start to, and remember that all of this is being regulated through our autonomic nervous system. As osteopaths, or in fact anybody nowadays, we all understand about how the autonomic nervous system will take you from rest, digest, healing and repairing states to flight, fight, freeze, or play dead states. So this is augmented through the autonomic nervous system. So when we start to see that a transitionary phase is approaching in our life, whether that might be something really wonderful like the prospect of getting married or changing job or moving house or having a baby, we can suddenly start to feel fear or freeze. And I can't tell you how many people I've treated who've come to the practice with a terrible acute back pain or leg pain. And it's because they're going on holiday in a couple of days' time. And the transition, the prospect of that transition, puts a freeze into their system so that their back locks up or their leg freezes. So that's how well we protect ourselves from the possible transition of dying. Now, and as I say, we do that collectively and we do it individually. So collectively, we find that we would rather not see the possible death of the NHS, even though there's a possibility that if we let that process go, we might end up with a better system. By and large, when one way of doing something ends, the introduction of the next way is better. But no, we'd rather keep these things on life support, hobbling along in a dreadful state, because we are collectively and individually, as I say, really reluctant to allow the transition that ultimately ends in death. And how much more healthy would it be if we were to be able to understand death in a different way, and thus understand all transition in a different way? So one of the first steps is to just sit as you and I are doing right here, and just find that beautiful stillness that we're so able to access. And then to understand that, yes, we're living, but we're in the most beautiful, harmonious combination of living and dying. We're constantly doing that. Right now, right this minute, we have tiny cells being born and other ones that are transitioning into dying. So we're the amalgam of both. And of course, that brings us on to the other reason why our ego and our being denies death. Our ego denies death because it simply can't tolerate the idea of not being in charge. But our higher self denies death because we know that it doesn't really exist, because we know that that transition takes us to a different dimension, but we're still present. And that's the other big step, I think, for our society and how we're beginning to, especially over the last few years, so much research, scientific research, not just the exploration of the spirit. We're understanding that, yes, indeed, death is not the end of life. It's a transition to a different form of it. I know that was a very, very long answer to your question, Sylvan, but I think to set the stage for death and dying, we need to understand, physiologically and emotionally and spiritually what we're doing individually and collectively in the face of it.
It's so fascinating to listen to you talk, because there's so many elements there. You talked about sort of transitions being hard regardless of what the situation might be. You talked about sort of systems being in place in society that make it hard for those transitions to sort of pass through easily in a way. There is this notion of sort of we hold on to things until the very end, and even then we're still holding on to even concepts or ideas that might be sort of, well, definitely not helpful, and thus sort of like, I almost feel like sometimes we can stay stagnant, and there's this reluctance to move with that transition in a way. You talked about sort of having a sort of physiological sort of connection. I wonder what kind of sort of how our body stores that physical and emotional events in our body or in our tissue.
Yes, that's such a good question, because we store everything in our body. I always like to see the body more like those Russian dolls, that stack inside each other. Because I think when we say the body, we tend to think just of this physical vehicle, don't we? This flesh body. But as osteopaths, and in fact everyone, we understand that we're not. We're mind, body, spirit. We're our emotional being. We're our physiological being, all interstacked like Russian dolls. So how do we store in that interrelated wholeness? How do we store all of this, these emotions, these beliefs, these concepts? Well, we do it in a variety of ways, don't we? So physically, we know that we store feelings. So if we are held in a state of, say, anger or anxiety or grief, those feelings translate. If you look at the work of Candace Pert, she was the first person to really truly explore this. I mean, it was groundbreaking research at the time. She was looking at what she called the molecules of emotion. And she discovered very clearly that if you are held in one of these emotional states, or conflicting emotional states, your body produces a whole tide of neurotransmitters and tiny molecular peptides that connect into our soft tissue, particularly into the fascia, into the fluid layers between the fascia, into the muscle tissues, and change our posture. It changes our posture. So if I was to say something, a sentence to you now that caused you to suddenly feel fear or excitement or anger, your body would change temporarily, wouldn't it? If I was to say something that really inflamed you, it might cause a tightening in your hands, as we were talking about that flight and fight reaction. You'd expect that. But what she didn't expect was how long-term emotions actually physically change the posture. And we know that. We see that in people, don't we? You can look at someone and think, gosh, they've had a hard life. Because you can see the burdens that they've carried. You don't see them physically on their shoulders like a rucksack, but my God, you see it in their posture and in their face and in the carriage of their being and the way they breathe. So for a start off, that's how we carry things physically, emotions physically. The other thing that we know is that we carry emotions in our organs. Now, we know that for absolutely certain because people who have received organ transplant find that they feel the emotion of the donor of the organ. So there's one particular day, received the heart of a young man. He was a motorbike, and she received his heart. And when she found and recovered and went through all this restorative, healing processes, suddenly found that she had the most passionate desire for drinking Coca-Cola. She'd never even been particularly bothered about Coca-Cola ever before. And I think this was when they first started doing donor transplants, you were really encouraged not to know who the donor was. But that changed, and relationships became much more acceptable between the recipient and the donor. And she ended up speaking to this young man's parents, and she said, since I had his heart, I feel that I need to drink a tin of Coke every day. And they went, oh, can't believe it. It was his favourite, so he loved that. So, that's just one story. But from a Chinese perspective, for example, each organ system, each meridian and organ system carries different ideas and beliefs. So, for example, the kidneys and bladder tend to carry and we know this from a Western perspective as well, tend to carry the emotions and feelings and beliefs that are somewhere on the continuum and spectrum between fear and trust. And the stomach and spleen tend to have the emotions and beliefs of acceptance and receiving and rejecting, which is what they do with food, of course, but they also do that with ideas and emotions and beliefs. So we contain ideas, beliefs physically in our viscera, and then we also must consider that we continue these ideas in our mind, in our emotion, and in our DNA. So people used to think that DNA was just about the colour of your hair or your height, but no, it turns out that the epigenetic coding is much, much more malleable and changeable. And it looks like 50% of our personality is held in our DNA. So not just in our physical body, not just in our organ, not just in our thoughts, but written into our DNA. And then let's bear in mind that we think that that I am only my ideas and my beliefs and my concepts. That's so far from the reality. We are a combination of our ancestors' ideas, beliefs, concepts, postures. Now, that makes sense. Of course it does, that I would inherit ideas from my father and his father or my great-grandmother. But we also inherit cultural ideas. So cultural trauma is passed down through the generations, or the response to those trauma. And you can imagine how that would feed into a fear of death, wouldn't you? If culturally you were, for example, from Ireland, where they had the potato famine, and hundreds of thousands of people died. Many left their homes forever. Many had to simply leave their homeland and move to another part of Ireland. But the amount of suffering and dislocation and grief and trauma was so immense that correctly it gets passed down through the generations, because any trauma is information. It's frozen information, and it will get passed down until it can be thawed and defrosted and integrated. So it's being passed down. Collective trauma is being passed down and carried in our bodies, in our epigenetic coding, in the way we're brought up, in the way we're taught. And hopefully, what really happens is that, as we were saying, we carry the reluctance to be re-traumatized, of course. So if, for example, collectively, you have been removed from your homeland, the desire for that to not happen again is very strong. So you feel that, no, I really don't want to move from here. Or you think, I'm never going to put roots down because they're just going to be dragged up and it will be agony. So then what happens is we're carrying these patterns of our own, of our ancestors. And ultimately, what we want is to be able to work with that. So ultimately, what we would like to be able to do is look at these patterns in our body, help to soften and release them physically, clear some of these very long-held beliefs, because they restrict us in allowing new beliefs, new ideas, to allow, and remember that epigenetic coding is plastic, it's changeable. So even if you're looking at decades of generations of collective trauma, it is changeable, which is essential. We need to all be doing this work, really. And as osteopaths, as craniosacral therapists, as body workers, we are called upon, really, to work with these patterns of held beliefs and ideas and concepts and traumas, so that they can be softened, so that we can allow, as you were saying, allow transitions of everything, of ourselves, of our family, of structures in our society. And in so doing, you know what happens. You increase the coherence within those Russian doll layers. You increase the coherence between family members, within societies, within communities. And the more coherence there is, the more healing there is. The more healing there is, the more coherence.
Yeah, that's so beautifully said, because me being from, I come from an Indian background, and historically I know, India went through multiple famines over hundreds of years, and as a result, and it's shown in studies that, you know, Indians have a propensity to diabetes and to hypertension and things like that, and it shows that, that physical, at least that, in this case, it's the physical side is then passed on through generations. Now, you talked about sort of generational trauma, and I don't know if you're on TikTok, Mary, but it's very big on TikTok. So this discussion on generational trauma and how we're raised, and how we're raised by our parents, and there's a lot of discourse about sort of breaking that generational trauma and sort of doing better for the next generation in a way. Is that any similar? How similar, how different is that from ancestral trauma?
Ancestral and intergenerational and collective trauma are the microcosm and the macrocosm, really. They're the same, because they end up in the in the individual. We're individually, we're all the receivers of that, aren't we? We're receiving our own family trauma stories, and bear in mind that we're also looking at success stories. I mean, that's the point of doing this work always, is that ultimately we're here. However traumatic it was, the outcome is that there is a living generation. So the individual family genetic story is being passed down, as is the collective intergenerational trauma stories and success story. And of course, we know that the trauma is cast out. The research is incredibly clear. Women who were pregnant during the 9/11 tragedy in New York, their children are born with secondary post-traumatic stress. And we know this. We know that the settings of the children and their children and their children's autonomic tone is altered. I think that for me, the way I look at this is that and I do quite a lot of work with healing the ancestry. And in actual fact, we're one of the only cultures and societies who aren't. We seem to have disconnected ourselves from our ancestry, and yet they're an extraordinary resource. Most other cultures and communities have a little family shrine. As ordinarily as you would have a kettle in the kitchen, you have a little shrine to your ancestors. And you have photographs and pictures, and every day you put a flower or some rice or something, and you're in connection with them, because they are the most extraordinary resource. Not only that, as we heal our ancestors, they can really work to heal us. So I think I am getting to the answer to your question in a very meandering way, but I am on my way. So you're asking, what's the difference between the individual receiving of genetic information or cultural or intergenerational informational trauma, I think it doesn't really, of course it does matter, and I absolutely understand that massive traumas such as populations in India have gone through are, but ultimately it's information. Trauma, as I was saying earlier, and Thomas Hubel does a vast amount of work with this, as does Gabor Mate. And if you're interested in this subject, I highly recommend you start to explore their work, especially Thomas Hubel. Trauma is being passed down to us because for us to help heal it. But what does that mean? What it means is for us to help unwrap it, to unfreeze it, to be able to integrate it. Why do we think that people, for example, in Ireland, who several generations back went through the famines and starvations, why is their digestion slightly different? Well, it's a survival strategy. Our ancestors and our coding, our epigenetic coding is saying only the people who had this coding survived. You have to hang on to it. We're passing it down because it may be the one thing that keeps you alive. So there's part of us that goes, this is terrible. I've got really high blood sugar levels. Well, maybe could we look at it in a different way? I've inherited this survival strategy. If I can make peace with my ancestors and thank them for this, so that this gift is passed down, not with so much fear, but with love, that they were giving me every tool that they had available for me and for my children and for their children, then we see it in a different way. Now, I'm not saying, obviously, that the only way to treat diabetes is to connect with your ancestors. Of course I'm not. I'm saying let's look at this in the most whole way that we possibly can. Let's stop being paralyzed in the face of death. Let's start really connecting with the reality that these people, these ancestors, these family members are still available to us. Let's start understanding that if we can do some healing work for ourselves and do some healing work for them, we set up a beautiful communication, a bi-directional communication of information, of resource and inspiration. And that's a very different way of looking at death.
I love that reframe, Mary. Yeah. I totally, and you can meander. Can I just say, you can meander as much as you want. I just love hearing you talk. But I love the reframe you put on it in shifting that perspective, because we always think about sort of generational trauma as a bad thing, but actually if we sort of reframe it to these are tools of survival that we inherited, that completely shifts why I might get diabetes, it completely shifts my perspective of what I've inherited and then what I can do with it. So completely changing. I love that. In your talk last year, you talked about death and dying, and there was one thing that you said that stuck with me, and it stuck with me for a whole year, and I've wanted to ask you ever since. You said it takes a lot of energy to die. And that just, it stuck with me. I mean, I'm going to try not to get emotional here, but I wondered if you could talk us through sort of what end of life looks like, and then what the active part of dying looks like, and if there is a difference.
Let's just look at that piece first about the energy that it takes to die. Well, we know that any transition requires energy. Let's just really go back to absolute basics here. Let's talk about when we learn to move. So we're tiny beings, and we're just learning how to walk or jump or crawl. Now, when we can look at that by looking at the way creatures do these movements. If you watch a frog, or remember what a frog looks like, and consider that in relationship to a baby learning to crawl. So before a frog jumps, it doesn't just start on the ground and leap up. No, it pushes its body weight from its up, so it presses its front legs down, which allows it to move back, to push force into its hind legs, and that loads all the muscles and the structure ready for leaping. And that's exactly what we do as babies. You see the baby coming up onto it's managed to learn how to tuck its knees under its bottom, and then it comes up onto its front arms, and it pushes back on its knees, and then it's got a propulsionary force, hasn't it, to move forward. So we know that the transition from being on hands and knees to moving forward requires that repulsion force, requires energy to do it. And we see that, we know that when we're going to transition from being at home and going on holiday the next day, we know that we're going to use quite a considerable amount of energy to decide what to take and not to forget the phone charger and to organise the whole thing. Now, let's consider that the transition of dying is the opposite end of the transition of being born. They bookend each other. We begin with one transition, one huge transition at the beginning of our life outside our mum, and we end with the opposite transition of dying. Now, when we watch a baby, when we really observe the birthing process, we see that what happens is that the baby and the mother's physiology start to come into harmony. There's a beautiful harmonization of movement, of the endocrine organ systems, of oxytocin. If that rhythm can be kept in that harmonious stage, if it's not interfered with oxytocin, and again, I'm not making any comment on the birth process when it has to become medicalized, but if it in the best way, what would normally happen is that synchronization process reaches a place where both the mother and the baby go into a stillness. So you get the first stage of the delivery, and then before the second stage begins, there's a deep stillness as they both coordinate and align and come into connection with each other. And then there's the big energy of the second stage of delivery. Now, if that be reflected in the dying process, which it should be, we see a very similar pattern where the transition into death, the person begins to harmonize and come into what they're doing is they are coming into synchronization with family, with their life, and with ancestors who's beginning to count. They might not be aware of that, but that's what's starting to happen. And so what's happening on the outside is that people are saying, oh, she's very unwell. I don't think the end is far. There will be medical procedures, of course, to alleviate or reduce the suffering and the pain. Then there'll be a stillness, and people will think, this is it. Then, many, 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 many times, there's this rallying. There seems to be this, my goodness, she's opened her eyes, she have a cup of tea and toast. this morning, and that is like a false dawn. And I mean, it happened to such a good friend of mine only recently. She'd been in a coma for a long time, and then she started to come out of the coma, and was, of course, really quiet and distant. And then suddenly she could talk and knew who we were, and was moved out of intensive care into an ordinary ward and died the next day, because that was and even I kind of I forgot that that's the most usual thing to happen, that there's that burst of energy, because you need that burst of energy. You're not going to use it for recovery. You might do, but actually you use that burst of energy to make the final transition into that next dimension, which is exactly what Janeth did. She used that. It was, I mean, when I look back on it, I think, well, of course she would have had a cup of tea and some toast to get the energy to do that next stage. One of the things that I do think is important, though, is that a lot of people are dying without the capacity to have that burst of energy, and that makes dying difficult, prolonged, unnecessarily. So if you are in that beautiful place and you're able to be sitting with your relative, your friend, or your partner or child, if you can sit with them and just try and see if you can allow them to be as harmonious and resourced for that transition. So one of the things that you do is you have to find the stillness in yourself to say, I let you go. I'm not, I don't want to hold you back. This is your journey. And much as it hurts me to see you go, you're free to go. So that's the first thing, is that you don't use up their resource by them trying to do the best for you. This is you freeing. So the other thing is to see how, can you help them be resourced? You're not taking away their energy, but can you give them some? What could you do to really support this journey? So very simple things often. Florence Nightingale said that the most irritating thing for someone who's trying to make that transition is noise. Noise, because the hearing stays quite acute right until the end, which is a blessing, because it means that and often by, this is the beloved. You're sitting with the beloved. So what a blessing that they can still hear you. And I was able to play my mum's favourite music. On the Sunday, I was able to play her a recording of the church bells near her house ringing. But can you imagine having extraneous noise of beeping machines and people coming in and out? Because we're not fortunate enough to be able to die at home or in a hospice. Often it's very loud. So if it's possible, if you are in that privileged position of being with the beloved, then do simple things. Is it peaceful? Is it quiet? This is like being a treatment. This is like the most precious osteopathic or healing session that you could ever be asked to do, to be granted the honour of doing. And we know how to do this. We're good at this. Don't be afraid. Go with the most open heart. Simple things. Keep the lips moist. You know, often the nurses don't have time to do that, but you can. So that's how you can encourage the person to gather the resources for that final piece of transition energy, like the frog moving back. You know, you're helping him do that so that he has that energy to make that spring into the next life. And bear in mind that already ancestors are gathering to help. Don't stop talking to the person when their body is declared dead. Their spirit will still be there, still be in the room. You can still carry on talking. When I was with my godmother when she died, we'd gone out of the room, and then when we came back, it was quite clear she'd died. And spontaneously, without, I mean, truly the thought didn't cross my mind. And I went, "Oh, Janet, well done, you've done it." Because, you know, it had been such a struggle for her, such a struggle. She was held to this life because she felt that she had so much more work yet to do. She did do. She was a hoarder. She always thought she was going to live long enough to clear her house. Well, so you can imagine it was very hard for her to actually let go and say, I'm going to have to leave it to you, Mary. You clear the house, I'm going. So it was difficult for her to make that transition. And when she did, I was like, oh, Janet, well done. Well done. So, yes, I think that, I hope that covered the answer to your question about, that covered the answer to your question about the energy that you need to transition. Yeah. I can't remember absolutely. What the other piece was now. Was it the difference between dying and the death process itself?
And so when someone's declared that, you know, their end of life versus when they're actively dying, I wonder, I always think of it as almost a spectrum, but I don't know if that's even correct, if there is a differentiation between the two.
I think it is a spectrum, but remember that there's one big piece of continuity here, which is the essence of ourself. You know, that's constant. So that part of ourself is there throughout, you know, is there through the, and as I say, you know, you and I are doing living and dying right now, this minute. You know, we're in that transitionary phase right now, this minute, as we're sitting here, is everybody listening to this now. And it's the same, you know, so going through that, the dying, you get to the moment of the death, but the essence of you is still present for a little while, and then and will stay for a little while. And often people see that white sort of misty light leaving the body, and what you do definitely see, if you've been in the presence of the body when it has died, the body is still there, and you look at the face of the body and you know for sure that the essence of the person is no. Often you can feel them in the room, but you know for certain when you look at the body that they're not in it anymore.
Yeah. You mentioned earlier about it being a privilege, and that certainly resonated with me. I was in the room when my mum died in hospital, and as hard, I mean, it was hard to watch. I'm not going to sort of sugarcoat that, and it is a hard experience to sit with, but I wouldn't have had it any other way. I was surrounded by other people, of course, and that helped, but I still consider it one of the most privileging and such an honor to be able to be in that room when she died, and just to be there, just to sit with it. And I appreciate that not everyone gets that opportunity through whatever processes, or if they're at home or in hospital, or if they die suddenly, for example. So I appreciate the privilege that I got to be able to prepare for that and to be able to sit with that as well. And I think for me, certainly, I didn't see sort of that rallying effect. And maybe it manifested itself in a different way that I didn't sort of pick up on. But it doesn't mean to say that, it happens the same way for everybody, or happens at all even. But I'm wondering, so you talked about sort of little things that we could do, as loved ones in the room, just being still, being there energetically, moistening the lips, things like that. I wonder then, as you work, in your work as an osteopath, how do you work with people who are in maybe not just like the end stage, quite literally, but how do you work with people who are on end of life care? What kind of things are you considering? What kind of things are you bringing to that room?
When you are working with someone who is terminally ill or in a coma, if you have an osteopathic training or craniosacral training, approach it as you would a treatment. So you ask, where is the potency? How can I be of assistance to support what your being is trying to do? How can I augment this with you? And be guided. So I'm trying to think of some examples. I think one of the I mean, there's going to be obvious things, aren't there? Like, how can I help make this person physically more comfortable? Are they supported well enough? Are their limbs in the most comfortable position? And then, if you are working osteopathically, well, if they're intubated, for example, can you help with the area around the lungs and the throat? Is that what they're drawn to? So I look at it from that perspective, just ordinary physical comfort and supporting. And if organs are starting to go into organ failure, you're not necessarily thinking, crikey, I better get some more perfusion through the gut or the kidney. No, you're just saying, what is going to help this system the most in its journey, which is what we're always doing, aren't we? We're not setting the agenda from our ego. We're allowing ourselves to be completely ego-less and to be guided. So that's the first thing. The other thing that happens is that in that terminal phase, there are a lot of contradictory, of course there are, emotions coming from everybody else, especially if it's a child. How couldn't you're going to be a parent sitting with your child, and I expect you've all already looked at Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's journey, which starts with anger and it quickly goes on to denial. And you can imagine being the parents of a child. Imagine that the child is, and in fact I have worked in this situation where the child was unconscious. He'd had a terrible accident in a sports arena, and he was unconscious and the parents were in the room, and he knew, when I put my hands on him, I could tell that he knew that he was going to die, but he wasn't afraid, but he was really struggling with how heartbroken he knew his parents were going to be. And somehow, if it's possible, I mean, you're obviously going to be doing this wordlessly, but if it's possible, you can support him on his journey. And so you're in the room and you're dividing your attention between the two. So is it possible for you to find a stillness for the child? And is it possible for you to help the parents find some stillness? You don't have to do more than that. That's all you are asked to do, because that will assist them on their journey, because they need to go through that journey from anger to denial to bargaining, which they'll do. They'll sit there and they'll pray and they'll say, please take me instead of him. And 100 other bargains will be made. And then after a while, there'll be acceptance. Your role, I think, is to see if it's possible to help make that journey just a little bit easier. And of course, everything is easier if you can bring coherence, and you bring coherence through stillness. So you practice finding stillness in yourself, finding stillness in the room, speaking in your mind to the boy, saying, we're doing all we can. I'm with your parents. We're looking after them as well as you. And you connect in your mind to the parents. And you say, this is breaking your heart. We know. We're just going to be in stillness with you. It's simple, incredibly hard, but at the same time, and as you just said about your mum, you know, you can't sugarcoat it. However, it can be several different things at the same time, like birth, you know, exquisitely painful and the most extraordinarily miraculous thing at the same. Also, remember that you've got the child, whoever it is, has got assistance. So you spoke earlier about dying alone, and a lot of people, especially in COVID, could you imagine the husbands or wives dying without their partner of 30 or 40 years, unable to be there, the cruelty of that. But sometimes you simply can't be there. As you said, there might be an accident and there can be an accident and no one's there. There can be suicide where the person has decided particularly, to be alone. And that's ghastly for the survivors to think, I wasn't there. When he needed me most, I wasn't there. Heartbreaking, and creates a lot of guilt for many, many, many years, which makes healing hard. And I'm not saying that the healing of bereavement is that you forget. No, the healing of bereavement is that you carry that person, but without grief, you carry them with love. You change the grief. Grief is love in the absence of the beloved. And grief can be transformed back to love because you understand that the beloved is no longer absent. They're present, but in a different way. So you were talking earlier about the pain of dying alone, or of people feeling that the beloved died alone. That's never the case. That's never ever the case, even in suicide. the person will have a particularly close family member, an ancestor, maybe their grandparents. There will be one at least, usually more than one, who will be there with them. Which I think is comforting. I mean, for some people, it's a massive stretch of the imagination, but if you can, when you start to be able to soften and thaw your understandings and fear of death, you can start to accept the concept of the continuation of life. And when you can start to accept that, you can start to accept the idea that, yes, of course his granny was there. Of course his grandfather or great-grandfather was ready to pick him up, to hold him, to connect heart to heart.
I love that. And I love that, you talk about this continuation beyond that physical body. And in a way, it echoes what, I was told, from the palliative care team that was taking care of my mum at the time. And, they said, and it stuck with me because they said, we only get one chance to get this right. So let's make sure we get it right for your mum. And that's all you can hope for.
It's so beautiful, isn't it?
I've gotten very still and very quiet because the words that you say are so powerful. And I'm just sitting here receiving it instead of trying to sort of come back with another question. I was just trying to sit with it because it is so powerful. Yeah.
It is powerful, and it should be. And there is a sacredness. There's a pure sacredness to this journey. And even as we talk about it, and even as your listeners hear this, they will feel that sacredness. And we're so blessed in the profession that we have that we can connect to that more and more easily every day. But yes, you can feel the sense of it.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm wondering if people were interested in sort of reading more or finding out more information, what kind of resources would you say are out there that people could tap into?
I think, of course, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross was the kind of forerunner of this from a Western perspective. But remember that ever since there's been life, there's been the transition of death. So cultures for hundreds of thousands of years have had really beautiful practices. In Ireland, they still have a proper wake. The body is in the kitchen or in the bedroom, and there's beautiful singing. There's beautiful keening songs. They're called keening, and only 50, 100 years ago, a song would have been written for that person to be sung. So there are well of rituals and pieces of music, and there's always lighting candles. So if you can start creating your own practice, but look into your cultural heritage. Every culture, there's not a single one that didn't originally have an amazing practice. Explore it. If it's a Celtic culture that you come from, if it's Indian, wherever, there will be one. So I would look down that because it will resonate more deeply with you. It will have because your epigenetics will just go, yes, harmony. If you're interested in a more straightforward how to really, be with the dying. There's a great woman called Felicity Warner, and she has got a book called A Safe Journey Home, which I highly, highly recommend. She calls her role soul midwife, because that's what she's doing. Just as a midwife at the birth of the child, she practices and teaches soul midwifery. So you can read the book, you can train with her, and you can learn how to be a soul midwife and sit with the dying as they transition, exactly as you would be with a mum having a baby. I think they're great resources. Yeah.
Yeah. And I love that synergy of that birth and death process. It's so beautiful. Mary, thank you so much for being here. Like, I literally could just sit here and listen to you talk for hours, and I think that's what I did the first
I
10
could talk for hours. So
I wonder if people were looking to sort of reach you or find you, how might they be able to do that?
Oh, they can email me, or I haven't got a website or anything like that. They'd have to email me, yeah. But
I
that's
can put your
absolutely
contact
fine.
details if that's okay.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that'd be an absolute
Yeah,
pleasure. And I just want to say,
great. Thank you
Sylvan, that
so
I would just like to thank you because, partly to give me the opportunity for you and I to have this conversation, but also with the reverence with which you held this. Because remember that we're holding it not just for you and I, your listeners. We're holding this space with reverence for all for the love. Your mum, my God. Be ancestral. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Mary.